Welcome to episode 115 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today, we get to speak to Scott Decker, who served in the FBI for 22 years. Early in his bureau career, Scott Decker, who has a doctorate in human genetics, joined the Bureau's fledgling Hazardous Material Response Unit in Quantico. On September 12, 2001, he led a team of FBI hazmat specialists to Ground Zero in New York City. 3 weeks later, the country came under attack again, this time from Anthrax. In this episode, Scott Decker reviews working on and eventually managing the science squad of the newly formed Amerithrax task force. The task force's mission was to identify and apprehend the person responsible for the mailings of anthrax that killed 5 people and permanently injured nearly 24 more. Scott Decker coordinated the early genetics and DNA forensics of the investigation. He then went on to supervise a squad of agents, all with advanced science degrees, as they coordinated the forensic aspects of the case. Their work charted new ground and established the discipline of microbial forensics. In 2009, he and his team received the FBI Director's Award for Outstanding Scientific Advancement. Scott Decker is the author of Recounting the Anthrax Attacks, Terror, the Amerithrax Task Force, and the Evolution of Forensics in the FBI. In this nonfiction book, he was able to write with authority on the events that took place during the anthrax investigation, many of which have never been publicized. You can learn more about Scott Decker and his book on his website, rscottdecker.com. This is a fascinating episode. Scott Decker talks about the initial missteps of the anthrax investigation. And I think this is a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk to you about today. For those of you who follow me on my Jerry Williams author page on Facebook or on Twitter at JerryWilliams1, you're aware that I posted a Time magazine article that both frustrated and saddened me. The article is titled, "The FBI in Crisis. It's Worse Than You Think." Now, I don't agree with everything that was mentioned in the article, but nevertheless, it was disturbing and somewhat embarrassing to read, especially where they mention a PBS survey which indicated there was a 10-point drop among Americans who thought the FBI was just trying to do its job. It went from 71% to only 61%. Again, if these numbers are anywhere near true, that frustrates me and saddens me. And when the Inspector General's report finally comes out, the public will once again be distracted by critical news about the FBI's former leadership. As listeners to FBI Retired Case File Review, you are aware of how dedicated and how hardworking FBI agents are. And I want to thank you for your support of the FBI. Every week I ask you to share the episodes with your friends, family, and associates on social media so that more people can learn who the FBI really is and what the FBI does. Don't forget to sign up for my FBI Retired Case File Review reader team and to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you. Now here's the show.
I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce my guest, Scott Decker. Hi, Scott.
Hi, how are you, Jerry?
I'm doing good. Now, I have been talking to you and waiting to interview you for the last year because I saw this article that you wrote for the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI about the Amerithrax investigation. And I called you up immediately, wanted to get you on the podcast, and you let me know that you had written a book that was going to be published. The book is called Recounting the Anthrax Attack, Terror, the Amerithrax Task Force, and the Evolution of Forensics in the FBI. And I thought, let's wait until the book is out. And the book came out last month.
Officially April 8th.
All right, very good. So this is really interesting to me because I've always been fascinated by this case because it almost gets lost in history a little because it occurred just a month after 9/11. Now, everyone in the FBI was aware of it because we were trying to do the leads and, juggle both investigations at the same time. But many people in the United States have kind of lost track of the investigation. So I am absolutely thrilled that you're going to be able to refresh our memory about that today.
Sure, I'm very happy to do it.
Before we get started on the case review, usually I ask my guests to do the case review, and then I ask them a little bit about their FBI career. But because what you did before you joined the FBI is so important to this case review, could you tell us a little bit about your background, your education, the work that you did prior to joining the FBI?
Sure. I went to college, and then I applied to graduate school, and I was lucky enough to get into the Department of Human Genetics at Michigan. And I got my PhD there in human genetics. In my field, biology, microbiology, that sort of thing, it's customary for us to do what we call a postdoc fellowship. Some careers, you go straight into a job. For us, you live at the poverty level. I had a rent-control apartment they couldn't get me out of in Boston because of our low income. But you're on an NIH fellowship, and you work in the lab about 6 days a week for about 2 or 3 years. And you build your resume, and you get your experience, and you publish papers. I did that, and then I went into private industry developing diagnostic tests using DNA, which back in the late 80s was kind of state-of-the-art. Not a lot had been done on that yet. I've always been interested in law enforcement. My father always spoke of it, and he had always wanted to be a state trooper, but in those days he had to be 5'9", and he didn't make the cut height-wise. But his always talking about it influenced me. When I was in Boston, while I was working, I decided to take a shot, and I applied to the FBI, and 18 months later they hired me, sent me down to the academy.
Did you have any idea that you were going to be able to use your genetic training in the FBI?
Absolutely. When I got to the academy, there were a lot of agents in the laboratory as examiners, and they were really making a push down at Quantico and at headquarters to develop a human DNA forensic program. It was, again, state-of-the-art at that time, and they pretty much told me that was my ticket into the Bureau, my PhD in human genetics. And the other agents, there are a handful with PhDs in molecular biology and micro. They all introduced themselves while I was in the academy, which was unusual for a rookie FBI agent to have senior agents introduce themselves. But the writing was on the wall that after 3 years on the street, which was a pension requirement as I understood it, I would be coming right back to the laboratory as a DNA examiner. So, as any new agent who wants to get out there and knock down doors, that wasn't really what I wanted to do. But, as they say, the needs of the Bureau. And then Louis came on, Louis Free. He became director, and he decided there were too many agents in the laboratory and too many in headquarters overall. So he initiated what everybody was calling Phase 2, and I really didn't know what Phase 2 meant, but he was transferring forensic examiner agents back out to the field. I was doing my 3 years in Boston street time, and I remember one of the examiners came, a tape examiner, very good as an examiner, had been in the laboratory for years, and he just couldn't stand being transferred back out to the field. He liked what he was doing as an examiner, and that happened to quite a few of them. They also told me, I'm going to stay in the field. We don't want you back at the laboratory anymore. because we're transferring everybody out.
And how'd you feel about that?
I was happy. What I've tried to explain to people, especially some of the executives on the Amerithrax case, who felt that we should almost be back in the lab doing experiments to solve the case as agents. And I say, we have a lot of PhD agents in the Bureau now since I came on, and there's a reason we're here. It's because we don't want to do bench work anymore. We don't like the slow pace of laboratory research. That's why we joined the FBI, to get out of it. We're happy to contribute with our knowledge and experience, but we want to stay on the street and talk to people and get out. It was very difficult for some of the higher-ups to understand that. But at our level, as a GS 13, 14 agent, we all felt the same way. If we want to stay in research and do bench work, we'd have stayed there. So that made me pretty happy. Then 9/11 occurred, and as you know, everything in the FBI agent's career and life changed. It just changed the way we worked and the way the Bureau is organized and so forth and so on.
So when 9/11 occurred, just like every other agent in the FBI, I'm sure you had duties that related to that case. But then within that month, the Anthrax attack started. Did you immediately go from working 9/11 matters to working on the Amerithrax investigation?
After saying how much I love working the street, I would have to say, after 7 years, the Bureau started a new unit in the laboratory. Officially, it was in the laboratory division. It was called the Hazardous Materials Response Unit. Brand new idea. It was the brainchild of Randy Murch, who was a high-level executive in the laboratory, since retired, but we stay in touch. Back in the late 90s, there was a lot of discussion about biological terrorism and biological weapons. And in fact, there was a defector from Iraq that really opened people's eyes about the anthrax development as a weapon in Iraq. At the time, we had no expertise in hazardous materials, no expertise in microbiology in the FBI. So the idea of the Hazmat Response Unit was, if a weapon of mass destruction was deployed in the U.S. or against a citizen around the world, but mostly in the U.S., we needed a group of people in the FBI that could deal with hazardous evidence, collect it, preserve it, and get it analyzed, knowing that it could kill you if you picked it up. That expertise wasn't in the Bureau except for explosives. We did have the bomb data center. But for anthrax, sarin, a radiological improvised device, nobody in your Bureau would know how to handle it. We could have call in outside experts, which we would work with, but they had not been trained in chain of custody, not been trained in moot court. So we needed the chain of custody expertise. We needed the testifying expertise.
What year was this?
97. Unit formed in 96. They went to Congress and got the approval for additional FSL and so forth, how all that works. The unit was stood up in 96. They started to post jobs in 97 looking for agents with backgrounds in medicine, chemistry, or nuclear science. Knowing that they had just transferred a lot of agents back to the field from the laboratory division, now they're recruiting to come back in. But it was the background and the level of the type of expertise they needed. I was successful in my application, knowing that I wouldn't be doing bench work, but we would be a response unit. We would go out to the field and interact with the investigators in the field, come back to Quantico, coordinate, not do the examinations, but coordinate them, and then do another response, a deployment. So we wouldn't be doing bench work, which I did not want to go back to. It's just slow. That was in 97. I was successful in my application. I was the fourth member. I stayed there for 3 or 4 years. September 11, 2001, we watched TV, and we watched the Twin Towers come down. Immediately, everybody knew this was not accidental. It was an attack. It was an act of war. September 12, I was on my way up to the World Trade Center with a team of hazmat experts, FBI employees. We established a command post within sight of the debris, what we called the pile. There's a couple pictures of it in my book. And we established a command post. We were joined by SWAT medics, the New York City, New York office, evidence response team. The guys I took with me, 2 of them were trained in urban search and rescue. which meant they understood collapsing buildings. And a lot of the buildings immediately around ground zero were thought to be not stable. They had a siren that went off. They had lasers in some of the skyscrapers, and if the lasers detected movement out of what their specifications were, a horn would go off, and everybody was supposed to run away. After the second horn went off, people stopped running away. It just kept working. Anyway, my guys escorted the evidence response team members up the skyscrapers, and they searched the rooftops of all those buildings around the World Trade Center, where it used to be. Collected evidence, looked for identification from the hijackers as well as crew members and passengers. Collected all that. I returned to Quantico about 2.5 weeks later, the end of September, and I had put in a transfer. I demoted myself, what we call a step down, while I was up there. I went into 26 Federal Plaza, the FBI offices, which were just about vacant. Everybody had evacuated, and they were uptown at an offsite. I found a computer, I logged on, I wrote a memo, faxed it to the transfer unit, and said I want to go back to investigations. I've done 4 years of response unit work, and I'm ready to go back to the street.
And why was that? Was it because of the call of the 9/11 investigation? Did you just get...
Yeah. Well, I sat up there at ground zero, pretty much filing daily reports with the powers to be back at Quantico and headquarters. I wanted to get back out there and find out who did this and prevent it from happening again.
Yeah, it was almost like a rededication of your investigative...
Yeah, exactly.
Duties, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always been my favorite part of the FBI job, is doing investigations. I guess not everybody feels that way, but I loved it. So I demoted myself, went back to a GS-13, and they put me at the Washington field office, which was fine. I lived in Northern Virginia. And on October 4th, the news started broadcasting reports of somebody in Florida who had contracted anthrax, inhalational anthrax. And as a biologist who had just spent 4 years developing preservation SOPs, collection protocols for anthrax, as well as botulism and ricin and so forth, myself and the people at the Hazmat Response Unit, the microbiologists that we had hired over the last 3 or 4 years, we knew that inhalational anthrax was rare. It had not been seen in this country for 25 years before 2001. And when it does occur, it occurs in workers who work with raw cowhides and so forth that are imported from Asia for use in the textile industry. We knew that animals got it. It was common, not uncommon, in Southwest Texas, Arizona. And it's because of the arid conditions, and the animal dies, decays, and the anthrax spores go back into the soil. It's dusty, as when the animals walk and eat, they kick up the dust, and that includes anthrax spores, and then they become infected. But it doesn't happen in Florida. It doesn't happen to a newspaper photographer who works in an air-conditioned building, and it doesn't happen to animals who live in a wet, humid environment. So
you definitely knew something was up.
I made a phone call to a guy named Doug Beecher. He's in my book. Doug is still in the FBI. He's a PhD microbiologist. I recruited him when I was in the hazmat unit. Very smart scientist. Very smart. Thinks things through. Doesn't make hasty conclusions. And I have a lot of respect for Doug, so I called him. I also called another microbiologist I had recruited, Doug Anders. When I talked to Doug Anders, I said, what do you think? Do you think the CDC knows what they're talking about? They've said it's anthrax. Doug Anders said, no, I think they blew it. I said, Doug, I agree with you. I don't believe it either. Well, we were wrong. They confirmed it at CDC. The Florida Public Health Department got the same results. And by October 5th, a day later, we realized something's going on. It's anthrax for sure, and it shouldn't have happened naturally. At the same time, Doug Beecher was working the phones. Again, I can't say enough about Doug and his scientific ability and his common sense. He was on the phone with an international anthrax expert that we had worked with over the last 4 years as we stood up the Hazmat Response Unit, Dr. Paul Keim out at Northern Arizona University. Paul was one of the few anthrax experts we had in the United States at the time. And at the CDC, we all knew a guy named Rich Myers who had been recruited by the CDC to set up a biological terrorism laboratory, analysis lab, down at CDC. And we all knew each other because we had worked in the hazmat response unit together. Beecher started working the phones, and he had CDC send a sample of the spinal fluid from the first victim, Robert Stevens, out to Paul Keim's lab. And Paul identified the strain of the anthrax that was killing, and then by Friday, the man was dead, killed Robert Stevens. And he identified the strain of the anthrax. And the way I describe it when I give a talk, strains are like breeds of dogs, is the easiest way I think about it. You have anthrax, and you have a dog. All the dogs are of different breeds. I mean, I have a beagle and a miniature pinscher here. Other people that I know around, my neighbors, they have a husky, a schnauzer, a miniature schnauzer. The dogs can all interbreed. They're all the same species, but they're all genetically different. But they're still the same species. Same goes for anthrax. In 2001, there were approximately, the exact number I believe is in my book, let's say 80 to 100 different strains that were known of anthrax. And Paul Keim had invented methods to distinguish them using DNA. So he found genetic differences between each of these 80 to 100 strains. And the idea Beecher had in sending the anthrax to Paul Keim was, if the strain that killed Robert Stevens was used in research in laboratories, it most likely was terrorism. If it was a strain Paul Keim had never seen, a newly identified strain, it probably would have come from nature. Again, elegant, but very smart thing to do. And at the same time, the CDC had transferred Paul Keim's methods to their labs and had the strain typing by DNA just up and running.
Is it a toxin? I mean, what would you call anthrax? I'm a little confused because it sounds like it can come from nature or you can create it in the lab. What is it?
It's a bacteria.
Okay.
It's a bacteria. It's related to, it's a bacillus. It's called Bacillus anthracis. The disease is called anthrax. Just by common usage in human nature, we all revert to calling Bacillus anthracis the bacteria, the organism. We use the shorthand anthrax. But anthrax is really the disease caused by Bacillus anthracis. It has cousins, Bacillus subtilis, Bacillus thuringiensis. Bacillus is the genus, and there's probably 100 different species now. But anthracis is unique in that when it gets into the body, it starts producing toxins that attack the body. The other bacillus are only infectious if somebody is immune compromised, very elderly. But anthracis immediately starts to produce toxins if you breathe it in. It gets into your stomach or it infects your skin. So that's why we needed microbiologists. We hired Doug Beecher. He was a microbiologist. I am not a microbiologist. I'm a geneticist. So the two fields complement each other, and that's what we ended up doing in Amerithrax.
So we still have a mystery out there. What was it? Was it a lab grown?
Well, yeah. When Paul Keim, he worked throughout the night, and I believe I put together the easiest way for me to write is to put together a timeline and use that as an outline. October 4th, Thursday, the sample was sent to Paul Keim, and by Friday morning, he had the answer. It took him hours. It was called a strain called Ames, A-M-E-S, and it was called that because it had come from a laboratory in Ames, Iowa. But at the time, it was one of the biggest, most popular strains to use in research. It was used to test vaccines. The community of anthrax researchers was trying to develop a better vaccine at the time. And Ames was what they used to challenge animals that were infected and vaccinated. Very virulent strain. It was kind of a moment. Paul, when he identified it, and he immediately called Beecher. Beecher agrees it looks like it's probably terrorism if they're using a widely used known Ames strain, research strain. At the time, we had no idea how many labs used it. It was thought to be widespread across the country, probably around the world. So investigatively, it wasn't the best answer for us, but it leaned us toward an intentional bioterrorism act. But we didn't have proof. Jump forward to October 12, when there was a letter found up in New York City at Tom Brokaw's office. And it was addressed to Tom Brokaw, the famous news actor. He's also a good writer, by the way. Started to read his books. He's excellent. So the CDC sent Rich Myers. Again, the community of bioterrorism researchers was fairly small in 2001. Rich Myers was flown up to Tom Brokaw's office to see if he could sort out what was going on.
Why did you think that this letter to Tom Brokaw had anything to do with the 2 victims that you have that were contaminated by anthrax?
The letter said that it contained anthrax, and there was traces of powder in the letter, in Brokaw's letter.
Well, that's a clue.
It was a coincidence, yeah. I mean, this is all on the background of 9/11. You know, it was still near chaos up in New York City around Ground Zero. So all this was going on, and to back up, part of what we did when I was with the hazmat unit leading the team up in New York at Ground Zero in September, the rumor behind the scenes was that a second attack was imminent, and kind of thought it might be a biological attack coming on the heels of the airplane attacks. So unbeknownst to most people outside a small group in the government, we had biosensors set up around Ground Zero, detecting to see if there was a biological release. That was all going on. So a biological attack was kind of on the back of everybody's mind at the time. Not in the public's eye, but those of us that had been working on hazmat response and weapons of mass destruction before 9/11 occurred. So we were all poised for something like this to happen. And to get a letter with a powder at Brokaw's office that threatened anthrax, to have a death 8 days earlier down in Florida from anthrax, never having seen the disease for 25 years, that was a coincidence. And we were also short on staff. So Rich Myers went up to see Tom Brokaw's office, and this is described in my book. It's a chapter in my book. It's never been told before. Rich never really told anybody the story. And for many years, we didn't really know where the Brokaw letter had been found. If we had gone to trial, the chain of custody would have been a little tricky with that letter. But as it happens, Rich did tell me the story when I began writing the book. And he just went up to Tom Brokaw's office. He got with a director of security, I believe, at NBC. Was he the NBC anchor at the time?
Yes.
Those 2 individuals just traced the mail backwards. And Rich found the letter. It was in a drawer. Again, I'd have to read the chapter again. It's been a while since I wrote it. But I think he found the letter in a bag of other suspicious mail in a desk drawer of a security guard who was sitting there at his desk eating a sandwich. He was having lunch. And Rich looked at the letter. The powder was falling out of it inside a plastic bag. It was another one of those moments. And Rich told the director of security, we've got to get this over to the New York Public Health Lab immediately. So they blue lighted it over there. Rich went back to his hotel, and within hours they called him and said, Rich, this letter is full of zillions of spores. And that's the title of the chapter in my book, Zillions of Spores.
So I'm a little confused, and I think everyone listening might be a little confused. If you had a hunt for the letter, how did you know about it? Who called in the fact that the letter was there to the FBI?
When we were investigating this, the Brokaw letter was always an anomaly for us. The chain of custody wasn't great. We really didn't. There were a couple different letters from Brokaw's office that were suspicious at the same time. They weren't anthrax, but there was some confusion about that. And who made the phone call? I couldn't tell you. As I said, if we had entered this one, the Brokaw letter, as evidence at a trial, I think the chain of custody would have been a little tricky to prove. Rich would help, but what happened to it before he found it, I don't think we ever got any good information about that. unfortunately. And I don't have access to the New York files or the sub-files anymore, and they're all stored away.
Did anybody get sick because of the Brokaw letter?
I believe Brokaw's assistant did get cutaneous anthrax. Again, I'd have to refer to the book.
If people want to know these little details, then I guess they're going to have to read the book.
Yeah, I mean, I could look it up for you and tell you exactly and I can see her in my mind's eye, and she got a cutaneous anthrax, I believe. I think Mr. Brokaw told her she should get vaccinated. She was worried. I know there was a baby that did get cutaneous anthrax very shortly after that from the ABC building. Cutaneous anthrax infects a person if the spores touch the skin and then get under the skin, and it causes big black lesions. And anthracis is Greek for coal, and they named it that because it made these big black coal-like lesions on a person's skin. So that's what happened up in New York, and the reason was that the powder in the Brokaw letter was not very fine. It was granular, and it didn't get into the air easily. But people did touch it, so they got skin anthrax.
But if they had inhaled it, that's when they would have gotten sick to the point of your first two victims.
Absolutely. Yeah, in Florida there was a second inhalational victim, Ernesto Blanco, who survived. But the two people working in the same office building in Florida that did get inhalational anthrax. Up in New York, the ABC building, Tom Brokaw's building, I believe the NBC building, people there got cutaneous anthrax, at least during that week of October 12. The reason I devoted a chapter to the Brokaw letter was that was what proved it was terrorism, it was a man-made act, intentional, and the mail had been used to do it. Until Rich found that letter, and that was the first letter we found, it still was speculation on our part. But he proved that this was intentional, and at least one person, if not more, were using the U.S. mail to make the attack. What happened, that was on Friday, October 12th.
Is that how the first two victims got in contact with the inhalation anthrax?
It happened at the America Media building in Boca Raton. America Media was the company that published supermarket tabloids, the National Enquirer, Globe, Sun.
Mm-hmm.
That could have a connection to the case. In that building, the America Media building where these two victims worked, we never did find a letter. We searched. And the post office is feeding into the AMI building. Anthrax was found in one or two post offices in Boca Raton. It was found in the van used to pick up mail for the AMI building. And a lot of it was found in the mailroom in the America Media building. So again, we never did find a letter. We couldn't prove it was used. It went through the mail, but it was certainly a lot of circumstantial evidence that led us to believe it had been through the mail. Then what happened, I guess we'll jump forward. Rich Myers was up at Brokaw's office on Friday, October 12. As soon as it was confirmed anthrax in the letter he found, he flew it right back down to CDC and began testing. Then we come to October 15, Monday morning. Scott Stanley, who I've known Scott for a long time, he worked for me in the Hazmat Response Unit. He went to the academy to become an agent, and then when he became an agent at WFO, we became partners for a while on the anthrax case. On October 12, Scott was at the Pentagon, sifting through the ashes and the jet fuel, looking for evidence of the attack, of the hijackers. We obviously knew there was an attack. He rotated back to the field office that weekend, and he and Gary Vienna, a task force officer from the Capitol Police, so Scott and Gary were on standby duty for anything terrorism-related that occurred in the National Capital area beginning Monday morning. And I'm sure, Jerry, you've been on standby. I did it in the bank robbery squad. That is your week to respond to anything that happens. You're reactive. You're not proactive. You're basically reactive that week. The National Capital Area Response Squad under Jimmy Rice, Scott was on Jimmy's squad, and he was at what we call the tip of the spear that week. And Monday morning, they got a page. Senator Tom Daschle has suspicious mail at his office. It's been opened. The Capitol Police are there. in hazmat suits testing for anthrax, and it looks like they're finding anthrax. This is overlaid by the fact that when Scott was with me at the hazmat response unit, him and I responded to hundreds of fake white powder letters. Hundreds.
I'm sure you remember the number of people who wouldn't let their kids eat their Halloween candy at the end of that month because of white powder.
Yeah, it was because there was the individual who was sending hoax letters, what we call white powder letters, but they're all hoaxes, and there were dozens of them. Scott and I had coordinated the analysis of all of those, and we were all a little jaded. We hadn't seen a real anthrax letter, but we had helped investigate hundreds, maybe thousands. So we're all kind of skeptical. Scott shows up with Gary Vienna at Tom Daschle's office, identify themselves, walk up, and the Capitol Police are doing field tests, and the field tests are like a pregnancy test, little plastic strips that turn pink if it's positive. The tests they were using were bright red, not faint pink like we might see with a hoax sometimes, but they were bright red, and they were being repeated, test after test. Scott talked to one of the doctors, Dr. Lee, who was in the Congressional Physician's Office, and they concurred in the hallway, and Scott says, I think we have a problem here. And the doctor, the Navy doctor, looked at me and says, I think you're right. I think we do. Tom Daschle's letter was rushed up to the United States Army Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID in Frederick. Scott went back to the office to write up his 302s, interviews of the victims at Senator Daschle's office. Up at USAMRIID, they were testing, and sometime in the evening, Scott was still in the office. He got a call, and again, it was John Ezell, who we worked with again, knew very closely. John was excited. He was a little nervous. He was kind of scared, and he told Scott, I've never seen anything like this before. He said, this stuff is so powdery, it's unbelievable. And it was pure anthrax, but unlike Brokaw's anthrax, the stuff mailed to Senator Daschle was a very fine powder. I describe it, if you ever open up a bag of dried oatmeal and pour it out in the bowl, some of it kind of floats up in the air. That's it. It just floated.
Okay. You can already know how dangerous that is when you talk about this inhalation anthrax.
Yes. And it floated all over Capitol Hill. It contaminated a dozen buildings on Capitol Hill. We shut the building down for months. We just quarantined it. And we ended up doing that for about a dozen buildings. Again, my book, in the footnotes, it lists everyone. The senators and the representatives, the congressmen, were fairly perturbed that they couldn't get back in their offices for 4 months. But this stuff went everywhere across Capitol Hill. A hero that's never talked about, and I did include a chapter on him, Dr. John Iseholt. He was a one-star admiral. He was the chief physician for Congress, and he saved lives. John saved a lot of lives that week. He opened up a clinic in the lobby of the building, one of the Senate buildings, and he had everybody line up, and he gave everybody who was there antibiotics immediately. They made an announcement Monday, everybody should come to my clinic on Capitol Hill and get antibiotics. So Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, it was chaos. There was 1,000 people lined up to get antibiotics. That night, he and Senator Daschle made a phone call to the president. President Bush guaranteed whatever John needed, he would get. And the next day, they had resupply of antibiotics. They started to open the valve to get the vaccine, which was very hard to get. Within 2 or 3 days, John gave antibiotics to thousands of people. He arranged for them to get vaccinated, and they swabbed everybody's nose. They found 100 people that had tremendous levels of anthrax in their nose, in their sinus passages. And at the time, we hadn't seen inhalational anthrax in 2001, but everybody in the biological terrorism research community was of the mind that if we inhaled this stuff and we weren't vaccinated, we were dead. Antibiotics would not help after the fact. Well, John Iseholt proved us wrong. Nobody on Capitol Hill got sick. And at least 100 people tested for thousands of fold above lethal infectious dose in their noses.
Wow.
And he saved their lives. He's a hero, and he's really not discussed in any of the other books on the case, which is why I made it a point to write a chapter about John. He let me talk to him, interview him, and very intelligent person, very gracious, very respected in the Washington medical community. I think he retired as a 1 or 2-star admiral.
So how did the buildings get cleaned up? They were shut down for 4 months. Then what happened?
That was a research project in and of itself. That was handed off to EPA, and the EPA contracted it out because they didn't have the manpower or the expertise. And they got hazmat contractors to come in, and the buildings were sealed and they were fumigated. They cleaned it up, and then after approximately 4 months, they went back and did a very fastidious quality control. They tested all the areas, again, to prove anthrax had been killed and was not present. Around the end of October, the Washington field office, the case was being worked in New York, Miami, and now Washington field office.
Let me ask a question about you, because you had already gotten off, had made a request to get off of the hazardous material response unit. Right. Did you go back?
What happened, I sent my step-down memo from New York. I faxed to the transfer unit. They shipped my butt back to Northern Virginia after I did that, and I was in limbo for about 3 weeks. They put me up at SIOC, answering telephones, which was fine. I mean, they needed the threat assessment expertise that we had developed over the last 3 or 4 years. Then in mid-November, I got my transfers ordered and headed over to Washington field office. But while I was at SIOC, because I had the background in the hazmat response unit and a PhD in biology, they did have me sitting in on conference calls and running over to Capitol Hill daily to keep track of the evidence and whatnot. You have to go back in time. Things weren't always done as we knew them to be done. A little bit of the case was being worked out of headquarters in combination with the field office, which all agents abhor that being done. It belongs in the field office, not headquarters. But we were so overwhelmed back then. We were still cleaning up 9/11, trying to investigate who was involved with that. Once the news hit about the letter in Anthrax, we had thousands of copycats, thousands across the country. And our resources were stretched so thin back then in November of 2001. But anyway, I joined the task force in November at the Washington field office. Scott Stanley was there. He left Jimmy Rice's squad, and he jumped on the task force that was being spun up, the Amerithrax task force, because Scott has a PhD in biology. They put me with him on the task force, and they gave us the ticket on working out the genetics and tracking down the AIM strain, which we did. The laboratory division was overwhelmed with work. So the idea was the field office would put together a squad of agents with hard science backgrounds that were working on the street, so to speak. And we would coordinate the analysis which were being done at labs across the country for the case. And we would also identify new initiatives to try. Not that the laboratory couldn't do it, they didn't have the manpower to do it. They were busy testifying in other cases, etc. That was what we did on the science squad. We would literally fly evidence around the country, escort it to different laboratories.
Now, did you work with members of your old unit? So you're on the Anthrax task force, but I'm sure you still needed the expertise of the hazardous materials response unit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Part of the reason they put Scott and I and another person named Dave Wilson, who was a chemist, master's in chemistry, on the task force is because we knew everybody in the field. For 3 or 4 years in the hazmat response unit, we had worked with people like Rich Myers and John Azell around the country, and we knew the players. And we also knew who to tap into expertise. Anthrax was not allowed at the FBI laboratory. The laboratory moved down to Quantico. The Marines forbid it. They didn't want it on their base. So we had MOUs with CDC, and all the analysis was farmed out.
I have a responsibility to break down acronyms. So MOU is a Memorandum of Understanding. It's like a contract between agencies.
That's correct. And in the government world, they're signed off by the heads of each agency or whoever has signature authority, and it provides a vehicle for transferring money for services rendered. John Azell would analyze anthrax for us, and then we would transfer money to John's facility in order to reimburse him for his time and supplies. With Falkheim at the university, we had a straight contract, and that would have been sole sourced because he was the only one in the country with his expertise. We worked with scientists at Quantico, Doug Beecher at the Hazmat Response Unit, and for about 3 years, we coordinated research and development of forensics surrounding anthrax. Our job was to coordinate, get the results, make sure the results were valid. They gave us a lot of free rein, really. But we worked hand in hand with the Hazmat Response Unit. The laboratory spun up a new unit, the Chem Biological Sciences Unit, because the Hazmat Response Unit was being overwhelmed. They were trying to deal with all the white powder letters around the country, as well as work on what became the biggest case in the FBI's history. But yeah, we all worked together. We met on Mondays every other week at Quantico to review. The case agents would be there, the science agents, which Scott and I were, and then the straight scientists from, like Doug Beecher, we would all meet and review results. We did that for about 3 to 4 years. I was made supervisor in December '03. Amerithrax 2 had 8 or 9 agents. All but one had a PhD in a hard science, and that one black sheep had a master's in chemistry.
So, suspects. Who's responsible for this?
At the end of October, we got several phone calls all at one time about a guy named Stephen Hatfield. Stephen Hatfield was attempting to make a name for himself in the biological terrorism research world. He was giving talks. Unbeknownst to me, when we ended up searching his apartment, he had my business card in amongst his stuff in his office. I'd never met the guy, but he was collecting business cards, and he was trying to establish himself as a subject matter expert in the world of biological terrorism. When we looked at his resume, he claimed expertise in production of biological weapons, wet and dry. He had been in the Army in Rhodesia during the Rhodesian-Zimbabwe War, when Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. And the reason that's interesting is there was an anthrax attack that killed several hundred people at the time he was there. He claimed to have a PhD in biology from South Africa. He had a medical degree from the Rhodesian Medical School. Everything on paper looked right. He even claimed expertise with the Sela Scouts, which are akin to our Green Berets over in Rhodesia. But the Sela Scouts are also known for their expertise in using chemical and biological weapons. At least that was the claim. I don't know if it was ever proved. Anyway, everything on paper looked good for Steve Hatfield to be our guy. We searched his apartment twice. We spent a lot of time looking at Steve. As we looked harder and harder, we found no hard evidence. We didn't find much circumstantial evidence. And the more we investigated him, we realized he had no expertise in bacteriology. Whoever did this knew bacteriology. They knew anthrax. They knew how to make spores. It was an art that was not practiced by many people in the country. It was an art. It was science, but there was also art to it. And unless somebody taught you how to do it and knew how to do it, it was unlikely you could do it yourself without training. Steve had none of that. He was a virologist. He worked on Ebola and things like that. Working on viruses is very different than growing bacteria.
Was the fact that he was a suspect publicly known?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Unfortunately, and this was in the press quite a bit, in those days, we were troubled by media leaks. A lot of...
Just those days?
Well, when Director Mueller came on board, there was a I don't know if it was a mandate, but it seemed to me at my low level as a GS-13 that a lot of stuff was being talked about in the press that we would not normally do about an ongoing investigation. The director and the AG held news conferences every day after 9/11, and they were putting out a lot into the media. They identified the hijackers. They identified that at least half of them lived around Boca Raton, Florida. So there were some real coincidences, but these things were known to people. At the same time, when we were investigating Steve and investigating anthrax, developing forensics, stuff started appearing in the newspapers about the investigation that shouldn't have. And there was just enough things wrong in the news stories that made us suspicious that one person was talking to the media that really wasn't part of the investigation, but they were hearing about the investigation. through the grapevine, classified information that's off limits, but unclassified stories and whatnot, it's pretty much known throughout the ranks. And the stuff was appearing in the newspaper wasn't completely accurate. So it wasn't somebody on the task force. It turns out there were several people leaking information, and it had violated the Privacy Act in terms of Steve Hatfield. He ended up suing Department of Justice, and he settled for several $1 million in awards.
I guess this is like the hazardous materials level of Richard Jules at the Olympics, unfortunately.
And you read my book, obviously. When I was a bank robbery investigator, I was very aggressive. During this case, I reversed. We had the sad situation where he had really turned Steve Hatfield's life upside down, not on purpose, but we thought he was a murderer. So we searched his apartment twice. He was under surveillance. We towed his car away so we could search it. It turned out that it wasn't him. We realized that after about 2 or 3 years, and it reminded me of Richard Jewell. Richard Jewell had really been put through the ringer in the media. He was exonerated after 4 months, not several years. He went on to become a law enforcement officer, did a very good job at that. He was the one that probably saved lives because he called in, I believe, the backpack at Olympic Park, one of the bombs. All this was in the back of my mind. We had searched Hatfield's apartment a couple times, and he wasn't the guy. At least me, and I don't know if other of the agents, became a little leery of jumping to conclusions. We saw what leaks in the media could do to somebody who was not guilty. It kind of puts you on notice that you really want to be sure before you accuse somebody of something like this. So anyway, but that's probably good because it made us look for evidence and demand proof all the more, rather than just speculate and jump to conclusions.
When did you come up with your second? Well, I'm sure there were more than 2 suspects. When did you become stronger in your thoughts that the next person was the person responsible?
What Scott Stanley and I were doing, in addition to helping out with searches and so forth of Hatfield's apartment, things like that, we took the Ames strain that had infected. We had samples from each litter. I'll leave it at that. It was all Ames. We obviously had to test each crime scene. It was all Ames, so it all looked like it was the same person or persons.
And how many victims do we have now? Because we've only talked about 2 people who either died or were deathly ill.
Yeah, they're each identified in the book, except for the infant. We didn't identify his name. 5 people were killed by inhalational anthrax. 17 either got cutaneous or inhalational, but did survive. I think there was one more, a postal inspector, who was never officially diagnosed, but he did get it too. That caused him problems for workman's comp, unfortunately. The 17 casualties, and one lived within a couple miles of my house in Stafford, Virginia. I would see him on occasion around town. Those people were never really the same. The inhalational anthrax scarred their lungs. The people with cutaneous anthrax bore some scars, but more emotional damage probably. Back to how we identified the second suspect who actually did it was Bruce Ivins. Scott Stanley and I went around. I had help of a couple of the newer agents on the squad. We sent out subpoenas and researched the literature, did interviews, et cetera, all the good stuff hardworking FBI agents are known for. We identified 16 laboratories in the United States that had Ames anthrax. We then leapfrogged from that and identified 4 around the world, United Kingdom, Sweden, and Canada, who also had Ames anthrax. And it was my job to collect all samples of Ames that were known. We set up what we called a repository, a deep freeze, and we collected over 1,000 samples of known Ames anthrax. Each one documented with a chain of custody. We knew where it came from. We actually called the laboratory directors to the grand jury. And at the same time, we took the Ames anthrax from the letters and we looked at the DNA and we found small genetic differences that distinguished the Ames in the letters from the main Ames strain that had been isolated back in 1981. We had that sample. We found that in a laboratory. So we have the Ames that was mailed in 2001. We had the original Ames from 1981. Over the course of those 20 years, we hypothesized that mutations would creep into the DNA as the Anthrax Ames was grown in the laboratory, grown again over 20 years. So we looked very hard at the DNA in the envelope Ames. We did find some differences. They were unique from the Ames isolated in 1981, the parental Ames, what we call wild-type Ames in genetic jargon. We found small differences. They were reproducible. We developed tests to identify those small differences rapidly because we had over 1,000 samples to test. And once we identified those DNA mutations in the mailed Ames, we then screened our 1,000 exemplars or known Ames strain, which we could document their history and who owned them originally. And we found 10 matches. Out of over 1,000 samples, we found 10 in those collected samples that matched the stuff in the envelopes.
Wow. That's a narrowing down, yeah.
It was an OSH moment for me because I didn't think we were going to be... I had my doubts. This was a very ambitious project. I had developed diagnostic DNA tests before the Bureau. And again, I guess I had become skeptical in this investigation because it was going on for several years. But again, we did it. We tested each sample 3 times. We tested each of those 3 samples in duplicate. We had different technicians test those 3 samples on different days. One of the things I prided myself as a research scientist was doing quality control. We used to say a good experiment is 1 sample for the experiment and 9 samples are the controls. And we did that. We were very rigorous in our quality control. So we found those 10 samples. They eventually boiled down to 8 because we added a couple more tests. We had 8 samples now that absolutely matched the stuff in the envelopes. We had all the documentation about where they had come from. They all came from the laboratory of Dr. Bruce Ivins, one way or another, each and every one. That was about the time we were ruling out Steve Hatfield. Again, all this was happening at the same time for 3 or 4 years, going in parallel. We then went to where Bruce Ivins stored this one flask. It turned out that these 8 samples from various places all came from one big flask in Bruce Ivins' walk-in cold room. Just one flask of 1,000 milliliters of concentrated anthrax spores he had made over several years. The flask of spores, highly concentrated spores in a slurry. It's almost a slurry because it's so heavy and rich in spores. It had a legitimate purpose. It was used to spray in the faces of animals after they had been vaccinated to test new versions of the vaccine. So they would vaccinate the animal and then spray the stuff in the animal's face to see if the vaccine worked. So there was a legitimate purpose to having this stuff. But the stuff in the flask of Bruce Ivins matched the stuff that was in the envelope, so the conclusion to draw is very natural. It looks like Bruce Ivins was our guy. He was already on our list. He was an odd individual, and there were some things about him that just didn't sit right with us before we got this evidence. Again, I bring this out in the book. I think I show it fairly bluntly. He constantly was trying to get other people blamed for the mailings, people he worked with, his own technician. He kept throwing people under the bus every time he got a chance because there were FBI agents up around his workplace quite a bit. He worked at USAMRIID with John Ezell, but he maintained a separate laboratory. John Ezell was our go-to guy for forensics. He had a different laboratory, but these people all worked together and they all knew each other, even though they didn't always share laboratories. What we immediately did is pulled the access records for Bruce Ivins' laboratory. All the laboratory had magnetic access control. They all needed access card to get in, and then they had an identification number they punched in a keypad to get into the second door. We pulled those records, and the reason we pulled those records, initially we were looking for Steve Hatfield's name. We knew the flask had the stuff that had been mailed. We knew it belonged to Bruce Ivins, but we thought it was still Steve Hatfield, or at least we were still needed to rule him out. So we pulled the access records, and Steve's name is nowhere on there. He had never been in Bruce Ivins' laboratory. He had never accessed that room. piggybacking wasn't really a possibility because there was a double entryway into Bruce's lab, and they actually showered in and showered out because he worked with the lethal anthrax. So piggybacking wasn't the answer. But what we did find when we pulled those access records, Bruce Ivins had been in his laboratory in the middle of the night, 3 nights before each of the mailings. There was a big spike in his activity. He came and went from his laboratory. For several hours he was in there, 3 nights before each of the 2 mailings. And we knew when the letters had been mailed from their postmarks. Some of the agents went back further, and Bruce had never done that before. That activity started in August of 2001, right up until the last letter was mailed. At that point, the light bulb came on, and everything seemed to come together for us. And it was obviously Bruce Ivins. It was not Steve Hatfield, and we just closed up the part of investigation involving Steve.
How did Ivins act during this time period? You were saying that he was always trying to throw somebody else under the bus, but as you got closer and closer to him and started looking deeper into his activities, did you see any type of different interaction with him and the agents? Yeah.
His reputation, he had been at USAM for 20 years. He was in his late 50s, early 60s. But his reputation was kind of a nerd. I guess nerd would be the way. This is a guy that would go to the gym to work out, and he'd wear black socks. I think he got almost... They tried to pick a fight with him at the military-based gym once, but he would ask for it almost because of the way he would act and dress. He would put on juggling shows for people. He played the piano or the organ every Sunday at church. He was always kind of the goofy go-to guy, always trying to help people, go out of his way to assist people. I don't know if it's politically correct to say. He was kind of the puppy dog. You know, a hard guy to hate, a hard guy not to like or be amused by. I interviewed him once about making anthrax spores because I never did it, and he was an expert, so I thought he could help me understand how it could be done. We could plug that into the investigation in the early days. And I inadvertently compared his research in biological weapons, defense research, to making biological weapons. I compared his research to actually making a weapon. I must have said it the wrong way. He blew up. He just was irate. And I was taken back because he always gave this puppy dog persona. And he's always, oh, you should look at this guy. And maybe I think it was this guy who did the mailings. Go look at him. And all of a sudden, this guy was just, I leaned back and almost put my hand on my gun. I didn't know what was coming next. Uncalled for. It was over the top. You know, I immediately realized I had said something that piqued him. So I apologized and you know, said, yeah, I'm really stupid. I didn't mean to be so naive, et cetera, and calmed it down. And, you know, as I was leaving, I just thought about it. I said, that was not called for at all. Something's going on with this guy. And then we coupled that with the fact that he was always trying to dime somebody else out for this case. And he knew where people's mothers lived in New Jersey, things that just didn't make sense. You know, but the letters had been mailed from Princeton, New Jersey, and there was a former coworker that lived there, and he knew where the guy's mother lived, and so stuff he shouldn't really know or care about. So he was always on the list, but as soon as we found those access records in that late night to lab, he shot right to the top of the list, and we really just zeroed in on him. A couple of the other agents, we had some real good agents working on this case. Pulled all his email records, all his communications from the different servers. We found, I list these in the book again, he had, I think, 12 different email accounts, and he would take his work account, email his personal account messages, and answer himself back. I would never think even to do something like that.
What?
Yeah, it was either he had 2 personalities, and now this is a lay person talking. I have no expertise in psychology, but it was either he had 2 personalities, which was possible, or he was setting up alibis knowing we were going to be reading his email if we got suspicious of him. He's that intelligent. So he's either doing this messaging back and forth between email accounts to give us feed us information he wanted us to know, like alibis and whatnot, or other people were responsible, or he really had 2 personalities and didn't realize what he was doing. I'd leave that to the experts to decide. When we investigated him more and more, he had a grudge against Kappa Kappa Kappa, a sorority from college. As it turned out, or a couple of the girls from the sorority would not go out with him, and he became obsessed with their sorority. This obsession lasted for 20 years. During an interview near the end of the case, he had committed suicide. Before that, his suicide, he admitted in an interview that he vandalized sorority houses. He burglarized them. He vandalized the sorority sister's car, the fence around her house. She lived in Maryland. He took long trips to other states and surveilled these sorority houses before he did the burglaries. He stole secret code books for the initiation process of the sorority.
I have to ask this question because when you think of somebody burglarizing and being obsessed with sorority sisters or, a sorority, was he going in there and, stealing panties and stuff?
No, he wasn't after that kind of stuff. What he did take was their code books and ritual books.
Well, you know what? I think that's kind of weirder than thinking of him going in and going through their lingerie drawers.
He may have done that too, but he didn't admit that. He drew the line. Just not normal. He carried this obsession on for 20-some years.
I wonder, doesn't it make you curious as to, I'm glad he didn't, for the safety of these young sorority girls, but it's kind of strange that with this biological weapon that he had, that he didn't use it on the sorority.
Yeah, that's a good observation. That's an excellent observation. We are always asked, myself and the other guys, Scott Stanley and a couple others on the case, what was his motive? And we really never did get a motive for the guy. We really never knew why he targeted the victims he did. We felt his motive was, back in 2001, the Pentagon wanted to shut down anthrax research. I bring this up, obviously, in the book, because it goes to motive of why he mailed, but not to who he mailed. The vaccine was very troublesome. It was causing problems in the veterans. At least it was thought to be behind Gulf War syndrome. It was in the press. There were a couple FOIA requests of him to produce notes about the vaccine. It pissed him off to no end that he had to do this, produce notes for the FOIA, take time out of his day that should be spent on research.
And I have to again define the acronym FOIA is the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act.
Right. Thanks, Jerry. Yeah. I think at some level in the Pentagon, again, I'm kind of speculating because I never interviewed anybody directly about this. I'm reading other books and reading between the lines a little bit. I think the Pentagon began to realize that was anthrax really a viable battlefield weapon? Was it really going to take out thousands of soldiers, Marines, sailors, soldiers? Or was it a better weapon than a 1,000-pound bomb that we dropped? Some of them we dropped in the Mideast in the early days of the war. And I think the realization came to it. It's a bad thing. It's a weapon. But is it really that bad of a weapon that we need to spend millions and billions of dollars in researching it? And I think at the Pentagon, the conclusion was becoming, no, the risk doesn't warrant the expense. We need to prepare ourselves for other things, other more terrible weapons of mass destruction, chemicals and nuclear, obviously.
And this was something he had spent a good part of his career working on.
His whole career. This was his life. And it's even in an email. He gets irate because in the summer of 2001, he was told that they would like him to curtail anthrax research and switch to glanders, which causes hoof and mouth disease. That pissed him off. He did not want to do that. And that's reflected in some of the emails that we read. We subpoenaed from the email servers. We feel that was the motive behind the mailings, but why he chose his victims, we do not know.
Can I ask you another question? You briefly touched on it, and I did read about it in your book. What is the connection between anthrax and Gulf War syndrome?
I don't believe there is any scientific evidence. Gulf War syndrome, back in the late 90s, I think it was Secretary of Defense Cohen mandated that all service personnel be vaccinated for anthrax. That didn't go over well with a lot of people. They didn't want to be vaccinated. And I know some of the tactical teams in the Bureau were slated to be vaccinated also, and some of those guys didn't want to be bothered with it. But it was a mandate for Department of Defense active duty. At the same time, the Gulf War syndrome, which was arising in the vets from the first war, the Iraqi War, which was in 91? Yes, early 91. I remember where I was. We were in the field office. We were all put on 24-hour notice. And they were coming back from Iraq, the vets, and developing what we call the Gulf War syndrome. But you'd have to read on the symptoms. I'm not an expert. At the same time, in the mid-90s, leading up to the new millennium, there was a reporter. He wrote a Vanity Fair article. I think his name is Gary Matsumoto. And he hypothesized that the vaccine for anthrax that was mandated for all service personnel, active duty, was behind the Gulf War syndrome. It was speculation, but I think Gary provided some circumstantial evidence. And I have the article. I haven't read it for a while. That was causing a lot of political heat for the Pentagon, and that was some of the reason they were deciding to curtail anthrax research. We believe, again, that was the motive. But why Ivins chose Tom Brokaw, Senator Daschle, Senator Leahy, which we didn't talk about, Patrick Leahy got a letter too, and not the sorority, I can't answer that. I wish I could.
That's fascinating. So he committed suicide before he was officially charged?
Yes.
How sure of you that he was the person responsible?
I'm 100% sure. That's the conclusion in the book, and I attempt to provide enough evidence to convince any reader that it's true, that he is the mailer. He agreed to an interview several times. The last couple, obviously, were with his attorney present. He did a proffer. As you know, a proffer cannot be used as evidence against a person, but it can be used to dissuade the prosecution from going forward. If you're lucky enough to convince them you're innocent. It can also be used to provide evidence if you decide to make a guilty plea to lessen your sentence, if you provide enough good evidence during the proffer. During these interviews, he could never give an answer about why he was in that lab, his lab, late at night, only before the mailings, and never before. Couldn't provide an answer with a reasonable answer. The answers he did give between the different interviews he had contradicted himself. As you're aware, as an experienced agent, if somebody lies, it's very difficult for them to go back a couple months later and repeat those lies verbatim, because they made them up. They're making this stuff up. It's not something they did. They're fabricating it to try and deceive us. And it's hard to remember exactly what they lied about the first time, unless they have it all scripted out, and they rarely do. So he did that. Between interviews, he contradicted himself. One of the interviews, he finally just shut down. He would not speak anymore. He realized he was digging a hole for himself, and he just clammed up, as we say. That leads any investigator, I think, to suspect that something's going on. He is guilty. He's lying. If he told the truth, it would incriminate him. And he killed himself in 2008 in July. He committed suicide. He had a couple very confrontational interviews by the inspector and my counterpart supervisor. It didn't go well for him. When he did the proffer, which was his final interview, it really went bad. He made himself look very guilty. The things he said, he contradicted himself from earlier interviews. As I said, no reason why he would be in the lab. No explanation for it at all. Whereas in the past, he had made up some stories which couldn't be corroborated with his laboratory notes. Now he just backed off in his final interview proffer, just didn't give a reason. Just shut up, wouldn't say anything. We actually came to find out that he had been seeing 2 or 3 psychiatrists, and when this all came about toward the last year of the investigation, a couple of the agents went to interview one of the past psychiatrists, and as it turned out, he had admitted during a therapy session that he intended to poison one of his former coworkers. He had a technician who worked with him on Anthrax who was admitted to medical school up in Ithaca, New York. So she moved away to go to medical school and ultimately became an MD. He was obsessed with her. He would email her constantly while she was at medical school. Always very friendly, very cordial terms, but he admitted to the psychiatrist that he planned to travel north to Ithaca and take a bottle of wine that he poisoned and give it to her. The therapist, she immediately tried to talk him out of it, and he agreed not to do it. She called the Frederick, Maryland police. They said, well, without a potential victim's name and more details, we can't really do much for you. They didn't follow up because she didn't know who the bottle was intended for. He never told her the woman's name. It turns out he did it. He did drive up. He admitted to it during an interview. He did drive up to Ithaca. take a bottle of poisoned wine. He backed off at the last minute. He did visit with her, but he didn't give her the wine. He brought it back home. The way I looked at it, he definitely had some mental problems. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, but if you look at his emails and some of the notes from the therapy sessions he had, he was a troubled person and appeared to be getting worse. He was taking a lot of prescribed narcotics, prescription drugs. He was also mixing them with a lot of alcohol, vodka, I believe. Under surveillance, he would walk down the street, erratically talk to himself. It seemed like with time he was really getting worse. It's not an excuse for what he did. The way it ended, he did his proffer. It didn't go very well. I think May of '08. It was obvious he was lying to the agents taking the proffer. The assistant U.S. attorney was present. At least one attorney for Ivins was present. And after the interview, I'm not sure the attorney should have said this or not in hindsight, but he told Ivins, it looks like the government's going to indict you, Dr. Ivins, and it looks like they're going to ask for the death penalty, which under the biological weapons statute, weapons of mass destruction statutes, does include a provision for the death sentence if a death occurs using a weapon of mass destruction. So at the federal level, it's one of the two laws that include provision for the death penalty. So anyway, he was told they're going to probably indict you, and they're probably going to seek the death penalty. The attorney actually got approval from DOJ for funding to hire attorneys. Again, some attorney's going to tell me I have this all wrong, but this is how I understand it. They got approval around that time for funding to be able to afford an attorney or attorneys that were skilled in defending against the death penalty. Because his attorney at the time, he wouldn't have done a good job, and he knew that. It was more than he was experienced at.
So this wasn't a perilous conclusion or threat that the attorney made. It was seriously being considered.
Oh, yeah. It was going to be asked for after the indictment. Absolutely. During the interviews, it came out on more than one occasion, he seemed to be very concerned about public perception of him. He did not want the public to perceive him as a terrorist, as a bad guy, as a horrible person. To him, that seemed to be the worst thing that could happen. And he knew once indicted, he would be locked up, smart enough to realize he wasn't going to get out. There would be no bail. And that would be it, even if he pled guilty. And I think the idea at the prosecutor's office, again, I'm speculating, but I think the idea was to use the death penalty and then take a guilty plea in exchange for a life sentence. Probably at the end of the day is what would have happened. Probably be in Supermax, more than likely. But he knew once the indictment came out and he was arrested, he wouldn't be seeing the light of day anymore, and he didn't have much of a chance to be in control of his own life. Probably just a couple more weeks.
So what method did he use to kill himself?
He didn't shoot himself. He didn't hang himself. He didn't jump in traffic. What he did is, around May of '08, I think it was shortly after the proffer, he went and ate 1 or 2 big bottles of Tylenol. What I didn't realize at the time, and I've come to find out, it's very common poisoning in the United States. Tylenol is extremely toxic at high levels. It destroys your liver. And once you start down that road, all your organs will start to fail, and there's not much they can do for you except life support after about 24 to 48 hours after poisoning yourself with Tylenol. So he did that. He was found unconscious by his wife. He was rushed to the hospital, and he was committed. Psychiatric evaluation. He was involuntarily committed because he had tried to commit suicide. During that time, he straightened out. He got off the Valium. He got off the vodka and so forth. He seemed to start to think clearly. After 2 weeks, he was released. He convinced the doctors he was okay. He wasn't suicidal. He wasn't violent. Again, he was a pretty good actor when he was clear-headed. He convinced the docs to sign off. 2 psychiatrists signed off, and he was released. We knew he was getting out. He was under surveillance. He went to a supermarket, a drugstore. He went to the library to check the internet because we had his computers by that time. We had searched his house earlier. And then he went home, and late that night, after being released, if I have my timeline right, he was under surveillance. The team was out there in the middle of the night, and an ambulance showed up with a Frederick, Maryland police car behind it. And they watched as a unconscious male was taken out on a gurney and rushed to the Frederick, Maryland hospital. And what he had done, as it turns out, he had again ingested a large bottle of Tylenol, mixed it with a large volume of Valium, and he was unconscious. He died about 48 hours later at the hospital. All of us that worked the case near the end are convinced he was the mailer.
That would have been nice if he had left a a suicide note, a confession, but...
Yeah, no note. I guess this was his way of revenge, I guess, as one final great act. We never did find any storage area where he saved any of the vials of anthrax. We obviously looked hard, but we never did find out exactly how he made the stuff. You know, all those little details that investigators really want to know before they can close the case. As I view it, it's a historic case. Hopefully it will never happen again. But what I do try to show in the book is that this is all on a background of chaos. This occurred.
Well, we've covered a lot in this interview, but there's so much more that you discuss in your book. So I just want to remind everybody again that your book is out now, brand new release, Recounting the Anthrax Attack, Terror, the Amerithrax Task Force, and the Evolution of Forensics in the FBI. So we're winding up now, but I do want to give you the opportunity to have the last word. So what would you like to say?
I just want to say the book was done at the encouragement of the owner of a company I worked for when I retired. And he had a copy of another book called Mirage Man, which he threw across the table at me and said, "Why don't you write a book?" And there had been several books written about the case. There's been quite a bit of press on it when back in 08 and 09. There were a few people taking a lot of credit. I realized as I read the couple books that were available, there were a lot of people that weren't being mentioned that had done a lot of work, stalled their careers, jeopardized their careers, took chances, but never got any credit for it. One is Scott Stanley. John Iseholt, we talked about, Dr. John Iseholt, saved hundreds and thousands of lives probably. It's never been written about. Jimmy Rice, very conscientious, never cared about getting any glamour, etc. And that's what the dedication page in my book will show. That's a quote from Jimmy. So the idea of the book was to get some of these people recognition that have never really been properly recognized, because people did stall their careers. They did not put in promotions when they could have probably got them, more than likely would have gotten. They just stayed in the trenches, did the hard work, and got really no credit for it. So that was kind of the motivation for writing the book. That's the underlying theme, I guess, as we say in the writing world.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Scott. There's newspaper articles and an FBI web story about the Anthrax attacks and the Amerithrax Task Force. And there is a link to his book, Recounting the Anthrax Attacks, Terror, the Amerithrax Task Force, and the Evolution of Forensics in the FBI. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If you're listening from a podcast app, you can share this episode directly from your device. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review so that every Thursday morning, just like magic, it appears on your device. And I want to invite you once again to join my reader team, where once a month I email a digest of the previous month's podcast episodes, my crime fiction recommendations, and I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. My May email features my review of former FBI Director Jim Comey's new book. So check that out. When you join my reader team, you'll get the FBI Reading Resource, which is a list of books about the FBI written by some of the FBI agents who have appeared on this podcast. I have more than 35 books on the list now. Of course, Scott Decker's book is there, as well as my book, Pay to Play. Talking about books, I have a crime fiction recommendation for you today. In the Clearing by Robert Dugoni. This is the third book I've read in his Tracy Crosswhite series. In the series, Detective Crosswhite, who lost her own sister to murder, has dedicated her career to bringing justice and closure to the families and friends of victims of crime. In this third book in the series, she is asked to solve a cold case that involves the suspicious suicide of a Native American high school girl 40 years earlier, and when a friend of hers hands her the old police file, she decides to look into what really happened and promises the dead girl's family that she will deliver the truth. I enjoyed the crime novel as I do all of the Robert Dugoni books I've read, and by now I think I've read 6 or 7. So my crime fiction recommendation is In the Clearing by Robert Dugoni. And when you're at Amazon.com picking up a copy of In the Clearing, I hope you also check out my FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. It's available as an ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. On June 28th, I will be releasing my next FBI crime novel, Greedy Givers, where Special Agent Carrie Wheeler investigates a multi-million-dollar charity Ponzi scheme. A novel inspired by one of my own true crime FBI cases. The second book in my series about temptation, corruption, and redemption. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.